Last week, United Arab Emirates walked away from OPEC after nearly 60 years of membership. One of the oil cartel's most powerful members just broke from the alliance that helped control the price of the world's most important commodity, oil, and they left with no negotiation, just a statement. The time has come to focus our efforts on what our national interest dictates. For decades, OPEC's power came from one thing: unity. When members agreed to pump less, prices rose, and when they flooded the market, prices crashed. But now, one of the lowest cost producers with some of the biggest expansion plans in the world has decided that arrangement no longer serves its interests. This is a big deal because if OPEC loses the ability to act together, some countries could get richer, others could get crushed, and China could benefit at an industrial scale. So the question is, if OPEC falls apart, who actually wins? So to understand who wins, we first need to understand why OPEC had power to begin with. OPEC is an alliance of oil exporting countries that coordinates how much oil each member produces. The logic is simple. If everyone pumps as much as they can, supply floods the market and prices collapse. But if members agree to limit production, supply tightens and prices rise. That means OPEC's real power doesn't come from owning all the oil. It comes from the willingness of rival nations to produce less than they could in exchange for higher prices on what they do sell. Saudi Arabia has led this system for decades, acting as the swing producer. Basically, they're the country willing to cut its own output the most to keep prices stable for everyone. In exchange, Saudi gets influence over global energy markets that exceeds its own share of production. The broader OPEC Plus alliance, which includes Russia, has controlled roughly 46% of global crude output. And that's enough to influence prices dramatically, but only when they act together. Now, if rival corporations ever decided to do something like this, the government would fine them or force them to break up. But because OPEC is composed of some of the most powerful countries in the world just kind of has to agree with it. Now, the UAE didn't leave on impulse. It left because the economics of staying stopped making sense. Over the past decade, the UAE has invested $145 billion expanding its own oil production to 4.8 million barrels per day. But its OPEC quota capped output at roughly 3.2 million barrels per day. That's over 1.5 million barrels of unused capacity every single day. Basically, billions of dollars of potential revenue sitting in the ground because an agreement said it had to stay there. Meanwhile, Iraq and Russia routinely overproduced their own quotas with minimal consequences. The UAE was following the rules while watching other members cheat. So from the UAE's perspective, the deal stopped making sense. Why keep following production caps when others bend the rules, especially if future oil demand may peak in the years ahead? And this wasn't just about oil. The UAE and Saudi Arabia have been drifting apart on multiple fronts. They backed opposing forces in Yemen. They're competing for foreign investment and tourism as Saudi's Vision 2030 tries to capture the economic role the UAE has played for decades. And Bloomberg described it as an increasingly overt competition for regional influence. The dispute about production may have been the trigger, but the deeper story was a partnership already under strain. So why does any of this matter to you? Because oil prices don't stay at the pump. They spread through almost every single price in the economy. The price of oil affects everything from the gas you put in your car to the food you eat. That means OPEC's ability or inability to manage supply doesn't just affect the price at the pump. It affects inflation, it affects whether the Federal Reserve can cut interest rates, it affects mortgage rates, business borrowing costs, and how expensive everyday life feels. When oil prices move, almost everything moves with them. And UAE leaving may actually even be a good thing, because if they start producing more oil and competing with rival countries instead of trying to control supply, you may start to see the price of things go a lot lower. And this takes us to one of the biggest potential winners in this huge dispute, which is China. China is the world's largest oil importer, bringing in roughly 11 million barrels a day. That means when oil prices fall, China saves enormous amounts of money. A $10 drop in crude can translate into tens of billions in lower annual import costs. Those savings flow directly into cheaper factory productions, lower shipping costs, and stronger export margins. Exactly what China's economy needs as it battles weak domestic demand and deflationary pressure. China is also positioned better than most countries to capitalize because it has been stockpiling oil and buying discounted, sanctioned Russian oil for years. So if OPEC fractures and prices fall further, China gets to run the world's largest manufacturing base on cheaper energy than most of its competitors. So the key point you have to remember is when oil gets cheaper, China benefits at an industrial scale. But the thing is, China isn't the only winner here. India also benefits heavily because India is the world's third largest oil importer. So cheaper crude means lower inflation, a stronger trade balance, and less pressure on consumers. Consumers worldwide also win in the most visible ways possible. They get lower gasoline prices, lower diesel prices, and lower heating costs. In countries fighting inflation, cheaper energy can also give central banks more room to cut interest rates. And the UAE itself may win by doing exactly what pushed it away from OPEC in the first place, pumping more oil, gaining market share, and monetizing its reserves while they still hold maximum value. For the UAE, it's not just about leaving an alliance. It's about betting that the oil they currently hold underground may be worth more if it's sold right now than if saved for later. And while some countries can win from UAE leaving OPEC, Saudi Arabia stands to lose the most because its economy still heavily depends on oil revenue, and its Vision 2030 transformation plans require strong prices to fund them. Without the UAE helping manage supply, Saudi Arabia faces a painful choice: cut production alone and sacrifice revenue, or let prices fall and watch its finances weaken. Behind Saudi Arabia, a line of oil-dependent governments face the same problem. Countries like Iraq, Nigeria, Algeria, and Venezuela rely heavily on expensive oil to fund their budgets. These are countries where a sustained price decline in oil doesn't just mean lower profits. It means fewer hospitals, fewer schools, and more political instability. High-cost producers get squeezed from the other side because if prices fall far enough, some US shale drillers and Canadian oil sands projects become unprofitable. That means investment slows down, rigs shut down, and layoffs can follow. Cheap oil creates winners, but it can break certain producers built on expensive oil. Now, the United States sits in a unique position in all of this because it's both one of the world's biggest consumers of oil and its largest producer. That means cheaper oil is never a simple story. For consumers, lower prices are great. Gasoline gets cheaper, inflation pressure eases, the Federal Reserve gets a clearer path to cut interest rates, transportation costs fall, and everyday life becomes more affordable. For the 330 million Americans who buy gas and groceries, cheaper oil is a direct quality of life improvement. But for producers, the story flips. If prices far too fall, drilling slows, shale investment drops, and energy states like Texas, North Dakota, Oklahoma, and Louisiana can lose jobs, tax revenue, and growth. America has seen this before during past oil busts. So the United States is split in two: a consumer economy that benefits from cheap oil and an energy economy that can be damaged by it. The final outcome depends on where prices settle and how long they stay there. This isn't the first time OPEC has had problems with each other either. In 1986, Saudi Arabia stopped cutting production after years of other OPEC members cheating quotas. Basically, they flooded the market and oil prices collapsed. The collapse devastated oil-dependent economies across Africa, the Middle East, and Latin America. And it contributed to the financial pressures that helped bring down the Soviet Union. It happened again in 2020 when Russia refused to cut production in response to falling pandemic demand. Saudi Arabia retaliated by ramping output. Combined with the COVID demand collapse, US crude oil briefly traded at negative $37 per barrel. Producers were literally paying buyers to take oil off their hands. and you saw dozens of American shell companies go bankrupt, and the price war proved so destructive that it eventually forced both sides back to the negotiating table. The pattern is consistent. When the alliance discipline breaks, prices don't just drift lower, they crash. And the damage doesn't stop with oil companies. It spreads into jobs, government budgets, investment, and financial markets. The UAE exit may be the headline, but the bigger problem for OPEC is structural. The cartel's share of global oil production has fallen from 50% in the 1970s, when it could shape the world economy, to roughly 33% today. While new producers like Brazil, Guyana, Argentina, and Canada keep adding barrels and they don't have to follow OPEC quotas. And then there's the energy transition. Electric vehicles are rising and long-term oil demand is slowing. And many producers know future demand may not be as strong as the past. And that changes the incentives completely. If the oil in the ground isn't getting more valuable over time, it's getting less valuable, the rational move is to pump now, sell now, and convert oil wealth into something that survives the transition. This is the quiet OPEC killer. When tomorrow's barrel is worth less than today's, patience looks irrational. And the UAE looked at that trajectory and it made its choice. The OPEC alliance, it only works when members believe sacrifice today will be rewarded tomorrow. The alliance weakens when members stop believing in tomorrow.